When teaching mindfulness to someone for the first time, it's often not a good idea to start with mindfulness of breath, as is often done. And I'm going to be sharing with you that and other insights about mindfulness of breath. And there's a lot to mindfulness of breath. It sounds very simple, just be aware of your breathing. But there's actually lots to it as a mindfulness teacher. So I'm excited to share some of these insights with you, and also happy to hear your insights. Please do send me a message through the various channels. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. So my name is Shamash. This is the Teach Mindfulness podcast. And we're exploring, how do you teach mindfulness of breath? Well, I've mentioned that it's not always the best one to start with, because actually it's quite a subtle sensation. You need to have quite a focused attention to be able to notice something as simple as our breathing. And so I always like to start with something easier to focus on. And one easier one to focus on is our body as a whole. If we take our whole body, there's all sorts of different sensations, whether it's aches and pains or pleasant sensations. And you can tune into your feelings in your body right now as I'm speaking. And maybe you'll notice that your posture's not quite right, or you feel a bit too warm or too cold, but you start feeling sensations immediately. Whereas mindfulness of breath requires a bit more of a finer attention. And as a mindfulness teacher, you may have already built up that slightly finer attention, but for absolute beginners, it's a bit more tricky. The other challenge is that for people who have had quite a bit of anxiety, it's often linked to anxiety for some people. So as soon as they start feeling their breathing, they start controlling it and they start feeling uncomfortable about it. And then quite easily, if they're absolute beginners, they could say, oh, no, mindfulness is not for me. It doesn't make me feel good, so I'm not going to do it. So you may not want to immediately dive into mindfulness of breath. If you find that you're teaching and guiding someone in mindfulness of breath and they found it uncomfortable, you don't have to keep forcing them to do that. You can tell them to move their attention to their feet on the floor, or the contact points between their body and whatever they're sitting or lying on. There's that sensation of gravity between our body and what we're resting on. So that could be a good place to focus on. Having said that, also don't be too frightened if your students do experience a bit of anxiety or some difficult emotions, at least a light version of them, because mindfulness is about allowing and accepting these feelings to come up. Remember, mindfulness is not about trying to relax or trying to get rid of feelings. That's the whole point. It's about making space and allowing them all to be there. So it's okay if the feelings of anxiety is there, and if they're willing to do so, you could even explore them and where they feel it in their body and their relationship to it. But if they're absolute beginners, you want to try and have not too much of a challenging experience for them, so they're more likely to come back if they feel at least a little bit good about it. How do you support people to be mindful when they're breathing? Well, as soon as a beginner and even experienced meditators focusing on the breathing, off the mind goes and starts wandering, and that can get frustrating. I could talk in the future about how to reduce that frustration, but one way to make it a bit easier to focus on the breath is to use a certain word or a phrase as they breathe in and out. There's some nice ones that Thich Nhat Hanh has shared, which is something like, breathing in, I'm aware that I'm breathing in. Breathing out, I smile. And then you can just invite the students to just say breathing as they breathe in and smiling as they breathe out. So just breathing, smiling. That can be a nice one. Or it could be just breathing in, breathing out, just the simple words like that. Or you could even use a neutral word like the word one. So each time students breathe out, you can invite them to say the word one. And sometimes I like to link it to acceptance and commitment training and getting people to think about their intentions or their values. And so they could just gently say a word which represents their value, like self-compassion. And they could use that word as they're breathing in or breathing out. Another technique is using numbers and counting, like breathing in and then breathing out and counting a certain number of numbers. But I'm not really so much of a fan of that. But there are some traditions where you kind of count the number of breaths, and you count 1 on your first breath, and then 2 on the second out breath, and 3 on the third out breath. And when you get to a certain number like 10, you come back down again. There's all sorts of different ways you can play with that. But one thing to share about these mantras and counting and all these things, you want some attention on the words, but you want to invite your students to give some awareness and attention to the actual feeling of the breath itself. Okay, so it doesn't become just a language exercise of just repeating a word in the head and just focusing on that. It's a tool to help them to maybe just calm their mind down a little bit, so then they can focus more on the breathing, and then maybe just focusing more on the physical sensation of the breath if they're up for that. One question that sometimes comes up, or I notice sometimes teachers saying, breathe in through the nose, breathe out through the mouth, or some other version of that. I prefer not to do that and let people decide how they want to breathe, because of sometimes their nose is blocked, or they've got some allergy, or they've got a cold or something. And then if they can't breathe through their nose, they think, oh, I can't do this meditation, which is of course not true. Whether you're breathing through your nose or your mouth doesn't matter so much. It's more about awareness, about mindful awareness. So give people the freedom to decide what's the right practice for them. And what you will find is that as they start getting more and more into mindfulness and into practicing mindfulness of breath, because it's a focused exercise, it's a narrow focus on one area, a certain type of attention, can be particularly calming. It can feel very calming. It can be feeling very centering. It can be very energizing as well, I've noticed some people say. Another thought that comes to my mind is you can connect it with mindful movement. And what I've been doing recently at the beginning of guided meditations is inviting students to, as they breathe in, moving their arms up. As they breathe out, naturally following that breath with arms down. And just doing that a little bit at the beginning can help to center the attention on the breath. And you can physically see your arms moving as you breathe in and out. Makes it a little bit easier to be with the breath. But essentially what you're doing is you're giving your students an anchor to center and ground themselves with this almost tornado of thoughts and feelings and sensations we can sometimes experience. And they can come back to it again and again. So it could be, and now I say it's calming and centering, but be careful that you don't try to share any mindfulness exercise as a form of avoidance. And I think this is actually quite common and quite a common misconception. Hopefully I'll talk about it again a bit more in the future. But meditation and mindfulness is not a technique to avoid your difficult thoughts and feelings and sensations. If you use it in that spirit, in the spirit of avoidance, then you're constantly running away from those feelings and thoughts. They're controlling you in a way. It's different. It's about opening up, making space and making room for these feelings and feeling your breathing at the same time. So you stop running away from your inner experiences, but you make space for them and get on with focusing on a meaningful life with the space for those experiences to be there. As you continue to guide mindfulness of breath, you can tune into the other qualities of mindfulness that I've taught about, that research has discovered through these thousands of research papers on ACT, that these 4 elements of mindfulness: acceptance. So it's about accepting the breathing just the way it is, making space for it to be there. Unhooking from our thoughts. So noticing the thoughts. Thank you, mind, saying something like that, coming back to the breathing. Connecting to your observing self. Now, this is a real fun one, because if you can stop being the entity that's controlling the breathing, you take a step back and you watch the body doing the breathing, and you become an observer of that natural experience, the natural waves of the breathing rising and falling. And all of this is connected with being present, being in the here and now, with this flexible attention to be present with the breathing, noticing thoughts and feelings coming, making space for them, and kindly returning the attention to the breath. So I've shared lots of ideas and thoughts there to reflect on when it comes to either practicing mindfulness of breath yourself or sharing it with others. Remember, you may share a 5 or 10 or 15-minute exercise, but you can start with just one breath. You can remind your students. I love to keep it simple and fun because then they're more likely to do it. So you can teach them one breath meditation, just taking a deep breath in and out every now and then is absolutely fine too. And then if they can do more, that's great. Make it accessible for your students so it's not difficult to do one breath or a few breaths. That could be their mindful practice to begin with, and they can build it up from there. And that's absolutely okay. Wonderful. Well, thanks for listening in. And check out our websites if you want to know more. Get in touch with me if you're a mindful teacher. You want to join our mindful teacher community, which is all about building your confidence as a mindfulness teacher, as well as maybe making a little bit of income, as well as making a difference in the world. And if you're thinking about training to teach mindfulness, get in touch as well. Anyway, thanks for listening. Looking forward to seeing you in the next episode, where I'll be exploring how to teach mindful mountain meditation. That's a visual meditation, mountain meditation.